Welcome, my friends, to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, and I'm thrilled you're joining me today for a fun conversation with a passionate author. We're kicking off the program, like it's our tradition, with a short reading from the feature book. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get started.
So I'm Mark Milke, author of The Victim Cult, How the Grievance Culture Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. I'll read from Chapter 1, From Cain and Abel to Donald Trump, A Journey Through Blame. What have you done, demands the deity of one brother as he inquires after the fate of the other. God, who well knows what just transpired, still requires an accounting. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, he exclaims to Cain, soon to be marked as the world's first murderer. Cain and Abel are part of the Genesis creation narrative, where the sons of the first family of Eden offer sacrifices to God. The youngest, Abel, presents the fattest and firstborn sheep from his herd. Cain, the oldest, tills the ground and offers up vegetables. God accepts Abel's offering and rejects his brother's. That makes Cain angry, very, according to the story. To add to the rejection, God then lectures the supplicant. Why are you angry? The Lord asks of a sullen Cain. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? This celestial dialogue then ends with the deity's warning, God's warning to Cain to not succumb to resentment, to an evil that can corrupt the soul, but to instead master and defeat it. But the caution goes unheeded. Instead, Cain lures his brother to a field and in a simmering rage murders him. The Cain and Abel story may be the first in the Western canon where the temptation to burrow in self-pity appears, where a man who spills blood thinks himself the victim. Rather than take responsibility for his actions, Cain chooses envy, and somewhere deep inside swears that the reminder of his failure, Abel, his own brother, must be wiped from the earth. Thus, in Cain, we glimpse the mindset of a self-professed victim all of us have encountered, a friend, relative, or colleague, actually injured by someone else or just by life, or who wrongly believe themselves a victim. Either way, they invite additional misery with their response, chronic looking back and blame of others, which sacrifices the future to the past. Cain illustrates the ambiguity to claims of victimhood in which we should approach with initial openness, because perhaps fate was unkind. While a traditional reading of Cain and Abel is the moral lesson taught to generations of Sunday school students to avoid resentment because that nourishes a bitter seed, there is another way to view Cain, God, and the slaughter of a brother. Maybe Cain, at least pre-bloodshed, should be pitied. After all, in the Genesis story, there's no hint that God instructs Cain on the finer details of acceptable sacrifices. Abel was a shepherd and Cain a farmer, and both offered gifts from their own labor. In this alternate reading, God seems less the Old Testament rock of consistency and more akin to a capricious Greek deity, one who toys with men on the field of life, absent any markers to navigate the uneven ground. Let us then side with Cain for a moment. He was set up to fail. It was unfair for the divine to demand that a mere mortal grasp God's wishes and then lecture him when he fails to properly guess them. Even if sympathetic to this reading, Cain yet had a choice. Even if the object of divine unfairness, Cain skirts a direct confrontation with the source of his woe. Cain does not plead or contend with God, as will other Old Testament figures such as Noah, Moses, Lot, and Jonah. They all debate God on instructions they think harsh. They occasionally even win an argument. Remember how Jonah convinces God not to destroy Nineveh. Instead, Cain marinates in his anger and lashes out at the nearest weakest target. Abel, who never suspects he will become a conduit for his brother's grudge match against God. But the destruction of others is not a remedy to our own real or imagined tragedies. And Cain's response signals the chronic human temptation to blame others and just as often to lash out at the wrong target. And it is right there where we re-enter Cain's story. When God first asks after Abel, we can almost see Cain's narrowing eyes, curling lip, and sneer in his evasive response. Am I my brother's keeper? The response reveals a man who thinks not even a creator is owed an account for the taking of human life. And then, in mixing red blood and black soil, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Cain's divine prosecutor creates a haunting eternal image of unchained bitterness. It turns murderous with the virgin earth stained by the death of an innocent man. And another man, Cain, soon condemned to extract a living from the same patch of earth he himself poisoned. Cain is thus the archetype of the victim psyche we encounter repeatedly in our own lives or in grievance narratives we will encounter in the chapters to come. Those harmed in the past, or who merely imagine it, but who become obsessed with blame and lash out with rage. And that is the other lesson in the Genesis story, an intense focus on the past and a refusal to consider one's own attitudes and actions, at least partly at fault for life's woes, leads to new victims and new blood spilt. Cain thinks of himself only as a victim. It's all he can see. Sound familiar?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Inside the Minds of Authors. Happy second birthday, everyone. I am thrilled. You guys have joined us this whole week, and thank you for the talented Mr. Mark for joining us. Hi, how are you?
I'm good, DC. Thanks for having me on.
I am so ecstatic you're here joining us. I can't wait to jump into this book. So let's continue the birthday celebration and let's just get inside your mind. Let's start with the book. What is this book about? I love chapter 1. You have me captivated. Where did this story come from? Tell us more.
Well, I've done a lot of work on what American lingo, I'm up here in Canada, but what in American lingo might be called Indian reservations, the reserve system in Canada, in American lingo might still be called Indigenous issues. I noticed that there was a difference between successful Indigenous Canadians and the ones who were not successful. I grew up near a native reserve in southern British Columbia, just north of Washington State. There was a very successful reserve that took advantage of its location by the lake and vineyards and the rest of it, and has become very prosperous over the decades. Now, that's not true of a lot of reservations, whether in the United States or in Canada. They took what they had and did something with it. Now, there's a history of discrimination against Indigenous folk in Canada as there was in the United States. Now, I think that's changed. I would argue that's changed dramatically, actually, in both countries. Nonetheless, there is a grievance culture that exists among some leaders in those communities. The fellow who wrote the foreword to my book actually used to be the elected chief of a very successful Indigenous reservation in Canada that's worked with natural gas companies to bring his reserve from poverty to prosperity. His name is Ellis Ross, and he's now a politician actually in Canada. And so that's where it started, was with this observation. He too noticed this victim mentality, and he just said it's destructive personally, but it's also destructive to communities and entire nations. And so that's where it began, was with this observation of who succeeds and who doesn't among, again, what used to be called Indians in old-fashioned language, but Indigenous peoples today, and who doesn't succeed. And I started to explore and research the victim cult. I found that there is tragedy in human history and now. Of course, there is evil, and of course, there's discrimination, and of course, there's prejudice over time. This is the history of the world, and there's been over 110 billion people alive on the planet. 7 or 8 billion of us are still alive today. When you have that many people are going to collide with each other, even unintentionally, and tragedies can happen and victims can be created, never mind natural disasters when you add to that. So the question, though, is what you do with that and what you do with that as a society. So in research for the victim cult, I actually found that attaching oneself to what I'd call a victim narrative or a victim cult, really where you obsess on real or imagined victimization, is dangerous. I look at the history of Germany. People are familiar with Nazi Germany. What they're probably not familiar with is Germans thought of themselves as victims all the way back to 1800. And there was some truth to their victimization by the French. Nonetheless, they got stuck there. And they glommed onto all sorts of bizarre theories, cultural purity and the later racial purity. Personally, and even among communities, if you latch onto a victim narrative and get stuck there, that's really dangerous, as opposed to more positive narratives that one can attach oneself to.
Okay, Mark, did you find common traits that people that attach themselves to this mentality had?
Yes, one common link maybe they were actually victimized. For example, let's take again the history of Germans. They were victimized by the French in the late 18th century. The French had invaded German lands. As always happens in wars, I mean, some of the stories that come out of what the French did to the Germans were horrific. There were stories of rape and entire pillaging and burning of towns and cities among French troops and what they did to the Germans. This, of course, creates tremendous bitterness and a desire to eject the foreign power from one's land. It makes sense. So they were victimized. But what happened was when they finally kicked the French out, the Germans, they began to get romantic about their own history. And they wanted to literally, these were the words, make Germany great again. But they did that through romanticizing their own path when they conquered others. So we've been conquered. Well, the way to be safe is to conquer others, to make victims of others, in other words. But they became really enamored. We see this again today, where people become enamored with the notion of cultural purity. You see this in cultural appropriation debates, if that makes sense.
It does. One of the things that my friends and I all usually say a lot is hurt people hurt others. And is becoming that cycle that you just described so well is that concept of feeling victimized. So I'm going to pay it forward in a strange sort of way by making others pay for the situations that I'm in. When you decided to take on this topic, because it's extremely heavy, you did not decide to let's talk about flowers and muffins and all that fun stuff. You took on a subject that is universal.
Right.
For good, bad, or indifferent is a very universal topic that a lot of people are facing and they don't even understand it. Like they don't even understand that because they face something, they have a choice. You can either make it something positive out of this negative situation, or you can continue the cycle. And you're describing those cycles. Whether you're looking at a society or you're looking at people who have been abused to become abusive as well. During your research, what did you learn that people could do to break the cycle? Hopefully you went that way.
Right. It's a good question, DC. Now, I don't take kind of a Tony Robbins, and with due respect, a 1, 2, 3 approach, like this is how you survive, or this is how you change your life and succeed. Because in part, it's not a political book. It's not an ideological book. It's not Republican or Democrat. It's also not like a self-help book. What it is, though, is a lesson, both bad. I start with the really horrific examples. You're right. It is quite heavy, especially in the beginning. But then I get to some positive examples at the end of the victim cult. How various communities fought prejudice and discrimination, for example, which is a current topic and for good reason. But how certain communities fought discrimination and prejudice and said, let us be part of the American dream. So the example I give is early Asian American. They weren't obviously slaves, but nonetheless, there was an initial welcoming of Asian Americans around 1850 when early Chinese immigrants came from China for the gold rush in California. Initially, a few of them were welcome, but the more that came, all of a sudden, white Californians at that point begin to react and begin to be very prejudicial. And federally as well, laws start to be passed against these Asian arrivals to the West Coast and in the rest of the country. For example, one early eloquent Chinese American writes to the governor of California who says, this is a white man's country only, basically, I'm paraphrasing. But this early Chinese American immigrant writes to John Engler and says, this is false in the extreme, and you know it. And he quotes the Constitution back to the governor, saying this is a land for all, and there should be equal opportunity for all. And you see this among early Chinese Americans. You see this among Japanese Americans who start to arrive in significant numbers in the 1870s. They push back. They push back in the court system where possible, and sometimes they win. Chinese Americans in San Francisco and Chicago, there's some local ordinances that basically try and push them out of the laundry business, which ostensibly are just regulations, but a court rules that no, this is an attempted act at getting rid of the Chinese American laundries. So they win that battle. Anyone born in the United States is a citizen. That's always been the case since the late 1700s. And so there's a case of an early Chinese American in the 1880s who goes to China to visit his grandparents, comes back, is banned from entering the country. But he was born in the United States. There's a several-year fight, but he wins in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court says, you were born in the United States, you have the right to be here. And so you do see this pushback. It's not that people should accept their victimization. So I point that out in the book. And the Asian American community is a good example of this. Now, the interesting thing I found vis-a-vis today, again, there's a bit of segmentation going on today and a bit of isolationism is the best way to put it, based on skin color, based on ethnicity. I think this is very dangerous. I think it's very counterproductive. Asian Americans said, look, we don't want to get rid of all of our culture. I mean, if one was a Buddhist, they weren't willing to give that up. Some were Christians, some were Buddhist, some were atheists. But what they wanted to be part of the American dream. And they said, let us in, let us integrate into American society, let us succeed in American society. And that's the part of the book. But I would say that the ticket to pushing back against racists in any age and discrimination in any age, whether you believe it's institutional discrimination or personal prejudice, is in part education and entrepreneurship. And that you also see among the Asian American community early on. They try and succeed in any possible way they can, precisely because they're actually banned from some professions in the United States.
That is such a good example of both sides of the equation. What you can do, taking where you're coming from and how you can flip it. So I truly appreciate it. When you were writing this book, do you had a target audience in mind?
Honestly, no, it was more of an itch that I had to scratch. I just thought this is an important topic, especially the more I researched it. I just saw this narrative in history and the world over. I mean, I mentioned the Genesis story, Adam and Eve. I mean, again, think about that. I mean, that's a perfect example. Think about the Adam and Eve story. I mean, what's the story basically? It's that God says, here's a great garden for you. He says, the one thing you can't do is pick from the tree of good and evil. But what do? We all do this, right? Somebody tells us not to do something. What do? Well, we pick the fruit anyway. We're all 14-year-olds when it comes right down to it. None of us like to be told what to do. In the Genesis story, the snake says to Eve, God just doesn't want you to have any fun. Go ahead, pick the fruit. Nothing bad will come of it. Well, she picks the fruit and then gives it to Adam. God comes along, and the one thing he asks him not to do is to pick the fruit from this tree for whatever reason. It's the end of their innocence. And he says, why did you do this? And Eve says, well, the snake made me do it. And Adam says, well, Eve made me do it. And in fact, Adam even takes on God. He blames God, right? He says, well, you gave me the woman. So everybody's blaming everybody else. Nobody fesses up. So think of a kid who's in trouble and has a sheepish look on his face. Adam blames God. You gave me the woman. He takes no responsibility. We do this in life. A positive story. My grandmother, who was 3 years old in 1914, she was a German living in Ukraine, a kulak, a peasant family, basically. They had the small farm. She had something like 10 brothers and sisters. She was the youngest at that point, I think. They try and leave the Ukraine. They go to Latvia. They want to emigrate to Canada. But talk about bad luck. The war starts just as they're about to emigrate. So they have to go back to the Ukraine. Then they have to go to Siberia. They spend some years there. And then the communists show up in Siberia. Well, they go back to Central Europe. She eventually makes her way to Canada. But as a kid, and she had other tragedies in her life. She met my grandfather. They both had to live through the Great Depression. Imagine a dry, dusty farm and you're penniless and poor. Nonetheless, they kind of made their way through life and eventually made their way to what's the Canadian equivalent of really the Napa Valley here up in Canada, in British Columbia. It's a very green area. There's vineyards, there's fruit trees. Now, I tell this story because she had lots of tragedies in her life. She lost two sisters early on. And as a kid, I remember watching my grandmother try and sign something. And she signed it with an X. And I asked I think it was my dad at the time, I said, why did grandma sign with an X? And he said, well, all that time she was basically a child refugee in Europe. She never went to school. So she never learned how to read or write. This was like in the 1980s when I first noticed this, or 1970s as a kid. My grandmother was a victim, and so was my grandfather. But growing up, I never heard them complain. They just talked about what a wonderful country Canada is. It's like the immigrant success story in the United States. They pursued the Canadian dream, the equivalent of the American dream, and they did okay. This is why in the victim cult, I write about the danger of thinking that something happened 50 years ago or 150 years ago is definitive for your outcome today. And again, I'm not downplaying tragedy. I'm not downplaying real harm that happens. But really, our own choices after at least a few decades are much more definitive. And sometimes it's not easy to change our own mindset, but I think it helps to do that.
I like the fact that it all comes down to choices and that we do have choices and that life can be fulfilling and it can be beautiful, even if you don't have the $1,000,000. This book, and I'm taking a huge guess, it is a standalone or are you working on a continuation to that?
No, this was 7 years worth of work and research. I needed to take a break and go have a life now. The victim cult, how the grievance culture hurts everyone and wrecks civilizations. It was a deep dive into history around the world and American history. One of the odd things, again, is people who are not victimized, but yet think of themselves as victims. The Georgia Bankers Association in 1920, as Black Americans are starting to move up to places like Chicago or New York in large numbers, right? Because there's opportunity there and there's less prejudice. The Georgia Bankers Association, in essence, claim they're victims of what? Immigration to the North. They say, well, we're losing cheap labor. Yeah, you are. And you should. Think of the arrogance of Southern bankers in 1920 who, in a very prejudicial age against Black Americans still, the Georgia Bankers Association is complaining. The audacity of that. These are not victims. Part of my book, again, I said it's not political in this sense. I don't take partisan sides, Democrat or Republican. So I try and look at everyone and say, okay, is their claim being picked on, or the Charlie Brown claim, everybody's picking on me? Is that true?
Mark, 7 years of work on this book, putting it all together. How do you feel now that that is all completed? How does that weight of that book being presented to the world?
Great relief. Winston Churchill, the famous British prime minister and statesman who won against the Nazis, said writing a book is a struggle, but basically compared it to winning a war when you're done. That's what I felt at the end of the victim cult. You know, there was research into the history of Rwanda in history of the United States and slavery, history of Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians and how they and Israel have dealt with each other over the ages, and Arafat's wrong approach as opposed to making the Palestinian state the next Hong Kong, for example. Their research into Asian Americans, as we talked about a moment ago, which is perhaps the most positive part of the book. In a liberal democracy, anyway, one can succeed. I really do believe that. If you treat people as individuals and you're treated as an individual, and that you always remember that, to think as an individual and not too much as part of a collective, because that can really hold you back, because then you can start making excuses. So it was tremendously fun in one sense to research all these various topics that went in, and issues that went into the victim cult and histories, but also to see the positive stories from those in liberal democracy who succeeded. I mean, again, not to be flippant, because in history, look, if one lives under a tyrant, Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler or Chairman Mao, your options are really limited. Often you have to flee if you want to succeed. But we do live in liberal democracies in the United States and Canada and Great Britain. There's a tremendous amount of hope there that we can do things differently as individuals and in our communities, insofar as that is something we have some effect over.
I love the message that you have, and I love the fact that you were able to find something positive, such a strong topic that some people don't actually see the whole picture. So I love it. Before you leave us, because we can chit chat all day, where can people find you? Where can they find the book? Give us some information on that.
You bet. Victimcult.com. And you go from there, you'll be able to find it in Amazon, your local bookstores, Barnes and Noble. But if you look for victimcult.com, you'll be able to see exactly where it is. And you can also get updates on the book there.
Awesome. They can also find you directly if they wanted to follow you in social media. They can do it from there as well.
They can go to victimcult.com or find me on Twitter, markmilke.com. But victimcult.com will have the links from there for sure.
We got one more thing to do before you leave us. Are you ready for the lightning round? Easy peasy. Don't think too hard of
Sure.
these questions. First
You
thing
bet.
that comes to mind: coffee or tea?
Coffee,
Nice. Fruit or vegetables?
fruit,
Hiking or skiing?
hiking,
Ebooks or print?
definitely print. I just moved and I have about 60 boxes of books to unpack.
Ooh, you understand completely. Here's a little different one. Let's see how you do. If you could play any character in any film, who would you play?
Oh my goodness, that's a tough one. Maybe Brad Pitt in The River Runs Through It,
Oh,
because I just love nature.
that's a really good one. So, darling, do you have any closing remarks for us?
Only that I hope to visit East Texas one day and see the pine trees. I've got some pine trees in front of my place and I really like them. And I just love nature, and I love to see new places that have some green around them. So I'd love to visit East Texas one day. So thanks for having me on, DC.
It has been a pleasure. East Texas is always welcome. We're absolutely beautiful on this side. Congratulations on the book. Congratulations on this incredible journey. And to our listeners, go ahead and make sure you check out this book, The Victim Cult. It's amazing. Take a look at it. Thank you so much for joining us this entire week on the birthday celebration. Happy second birthday. And we'll be back on our regular schedule for a brand new author. So thank you, everyone. Make sure to like the podcast and make sure to share with somebody. Bye.